What's going on, everybody? How you doing? Everybody tired and lazy? Yeah? Well, welcome to 3D Workflows for Lazy People. I assume that if you're like me, you don't want to work very hard. You're all sitting down, so that's a good start. My name is Chad Ashley, and I work at Grayscale Gorilla, and I'm a creative director there. And if you don't know Grayscale Gorilla, we make tools and training for Cinema 4D artists, a little bit After Effects stuff. And we've been doing it quite a long time. Before that, I was actually a creative director at Digital Kitchen in Chicago. I was there for about 10 years where I did a lot of production work. I did a lot of CG production, live action production, all sorts of different things using CG. And in that 20 years of experience doing production, I kind of picked up a lot of tips and tricks on how to not work hard, and I'm going to share some of them with you today. As I said before, I started in Maya, and then I went to 3ds Max, and now I'm in Cinema 4D. Only been using Cinema 4D for about a year and a half, and it was kind of a journey for me, and I wanted to make sure when I made the switch from 3ds Max to Cinema 4D that it was ready to be used in a production, as a production tool. Because I'd done so many productions using Maya and Max that I just wanted to make sure that Cinema 4D could do these things for me that I'm going to show you. And I was, very pleasantly surprised that it could actually do a lot more, and I'm going to show you some of these things today. What are we learning? Well, we're going to learn as much as we humanly can in under an hour, okay? So we're going to talk about how we're going to use standard Cinema 4D features to improve your production workflow, okay? I'm going to show you some Cinema 4D features that are going to help you be more lazy, okay? And we all know you want to be lazy, right? All right, good. So this whole thing, if you take nothing away from this, I want you to understand that you can be more creative and work less if you just employ some of these techniques, okay? So you're saying, like, why do I care? I'm lazy. I just came for a seat, I just came to sit down to, take the load off. Well, less time working means more time drinking, and that's good, okay? So why should anyone care about this talk that I'm going to give? Why would anybody want to sit down or tune in online? Well, you're going to use some of these techniques to have less wasted time on repetitive tasks. You're going to make less mistakes. You're going to have your coworkers, they're going to hate you less. Okay, so I know that's a shock, but yeah, your coworkers will hate you less. You'll have more time to create. You're going to have more time to iterate. You're going to have more time to drink. You're going to make more money, a lot more money. A lot. No, I'm just kidding. You might make a little more money. I don't know. Your company will make more money because you're doing more work and you're not doing the boring stuff that nobody wants to do, right? But this phrase always comes up when I'm talking about workflow. An ounce of prevention. Does anybody know how to finish this phrase? Anybody in here? Ounce of prevention is? Yes. It's worth a pound of cure. Thank you. Now, what I think about this, I think about a tight production can meet a tight schedule. If you run a tight ship, you can run a tight schedule. What are we going to talk about? Well, first we're going to talk about process. We're going to talk about project folder naming. We're going to talk about project naming. We're going to talk about scene starters. We're going to talk about mission layouts, customization, content browser hacks. Second thing we're going to talk about is my previs workflow. I'm going to break down how I do previs and work with an editor on my Cinema 4D projects. We're going to talk about the layout workflow that I like to use, and we're going to talk a little bit about XREFs, okay? This is everything that we're going to talk about, hopefully, if we have time. I'm going to try to go fast. So this all started when Grayscale Gorilla recently launched a product called Gorilla Grade LUTs. It's a color grading tool for After Effects, Premiere, Nuke, that sort of thing. And we were going to announce it, and so we created a live action promo for this announcement. And we sat down, Nick, Chris, and I sat down, and we're like, you know what? We really need a CG version of this promo to really talk to our audience and make sure that we're covering all of our bases. This was 4 days before we were going to announce, okay? So I said, okay, that's cool. I'm one artist. I have no client. It's a perfect scenario, right? So how was I able to do that in 4 days? Well, before I even talk about how I was able to do it in 4 days, I'm going to show you the piece itself so you can see what we were able to do. Cool. So that was, thank you. You don't have to clap, but all right. So 4 days to concept and create this promo. It was about 7 shots. I probably had like more like 10, but you know, I was cutting it in Premiere. It's all done in Cinema 4D, R18. There was no live action in that piece. It was all rendered in Arnold. It was all sent to the cloud and rendered on Pixel Plow. It was all composited in Blackmagic Design Fusion, and it was all cut in Adobe Premiere. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. One guy in 4 days creating that. Now I've been doing it a while, and that has something to do with it. But I like to think a lot of it has to do with how I work and my process. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about my process. And I know it's not like super exciting, but it is an important part of everybody's project because it's the beginning, right? It's how it sets the tone for the entire process. Whether you're working by yourself or you're working with a huge team of artists, you want to make sure that your process is set, okay? So I'm going to walk you through really quickly here. I'm going to show you my folder structure. I'm going to actually make this folder structure available on C4D Live after the presentation so that you can dissect it and compare it to your own project folder. If you don't have a project folder that you create for every job that you do, make one. Make one as soon as you get home. Make one that works for you, okay? So you can just take a look here. Mine's very simple. I have the X's here, which would be a job number. I have my job name here. I always replace that, obviously. When I get a job, I make a copy of this folder. You can see it's very simple, not a lot going on. I have a file here called project naming, which I'll open in a minute. Just real quick tour of this project folder. Projects, obviously C4D, Fusion, After Effects. I'll get back to the C4D project files in a minute. Assets, have some place to put your models. Anything that you might cache out. You want to have a place to put these things. And under elements, obviously the usual suspects. I've got client files where I have production assets that the client might have sent me. I also have the, if we go back here, let's go back to elements. I also have a footage directory if the client has given me any footage. I've got images here, the run-of-the-mill stuff. One thing I do like to keep, though, and I recommend everybody do this, is create a production document where you actually write down the producer's name of the agency or studio that you're working for so you don't forget. You might open this project file 2 years from now and not remember anybody that was involved. So keep notes, right? So this entire talk that I'm going to give is hopefully going to inspire you guys to work a little smarter. Renders obviously is where I'm putting all of my renders, and I'm going to talk about how I never have to output or name an output using takes and tokens, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's a very cool workflow where you never have to name an output again. All right, and then exports obviously is for exports, okay? So let's just dive back into, and this is where I would put final stuff for clients and review stuff for clients here. But let's get back into the project directory, the C4D project directory. This is what I call my scene starters. What I mean by scene starters is you probably see a lot of people, they'll open up Cinema, they'll tweak Cinema to the way they like it, and they'll create that as the new Cinema file. So every time you start Cinema, it actually starts with those settings, right? So I took that idea and went a little bit further with it. I actually had an afternoon, so I went ahead and I created what I call scene starters. I created scene files that are basically built for specific workflows that I might need. So you can see I have an Arnold 1080p 24 FIPS starter. I have an Arnold 1080p 30 FIPS, Redshift 30 FIPS. All these different workflows built into one scene file. The idea here is that I'm not going down into my taskbar and launching Cinema blank, because that's wasted time. I'm going to have to open up Cinema. I'm going to have to load up files. I'm going to have to find all my assets. No, I've already got these files built. They're already here. just double click whichever one I'm starting that day. Where am I going today? Well, I'm going to make a project using Arnold, and it's going to be 30 frames per second. Okay, let's start with that. Launch the program. I'm immediately going to be in an environment where I can start making stuff. Okay, so I'm going to load in my my favorite template, or my favorite layout rather. Okay, so in this scene, it's an Arnold starting scene. I've already got layers pre-built. I've got lights and cams, so it's ready to be organized. I've got a previs override material right here. I've got my layout the way I want it. I've got Arnold set up as my output. Everything is here for me. I've got my render presets already loaded. So by creating scene starters for your workflow, you save time. You don't have to open up Cinema and grab the right things and do this and that. It just gets you there faster, and that's what we want to do. We want to be able to create more and work less. Well, let's talk a little bit about layout. So you can see here, one of the things I love about Cinema 4D is the ability to create and manipulate layouts. I came from 3ds Max where you don't have tearaway layouts. You can't do these things. You can't like tear off something and move it around. Oh, now I've done it. Well, good thing I can just go back. So I love making layouts to match my mission. So what I mean by that is, like, don't be afraid to change the way Cinema 4D looks. So you can see here, I've got an empty scene, and I'm using my startup layout. But let's say if I was going to do some modeling, and I'll just grab something just so you're not looking at a blank screen, and I have a whole modeling layout, where I get rid of the timeline. I don't need the timeline, I'm modeling. So I'd strip down everything that I don't need and only have the things that I do need, so that when I go in and I want to edit an object, I can simply come over here, and all my poly editing tools are right here on the right-hand side. So it's a really good idea to create layouts that match your mission, and then don't be afraid to dive in between them. So this is my animation layout. It's basically all timeline. I don't have much else going on. I'm just going to be concentrating on animating. But the day in and day out layout that I use is probably going to be my startup layout, which basically has my little tabs over here, which I love the fact that you can create tabs out of windows in Cinema 4D. And I've got all my tabs that I'm going to walk you through in a minute. And then I also have over here all my attributes, my axis center, my layers. I like to have my layers up at the same time as my object manager, actually, because it really helps me organize my scene. So let's kind of just take a look through here what I've got. Let me just open up a scene really quickly here. And I'm going to open up the previs scene that was used to make the demo or the promo that I showed you earlier. Okay. So before we dive into the scene file, I want to show you how I'm organizing things up here in my layout. You can see I've got my objects, I've got my takes, and I've got this tab called Models. Now you're probably saying, well, that's weird. I don't have that tab. I don't have that. It's because I created this in the content browser. I created a folder called Models, and I went ahead and I populated it with all the models that I use every day. So the idea here is keep everything that you use on a daily basis at arm's length at all time. Use the content browser the way it was meant to be used, and that is to organize and make your life easier. I also have things like camera rigs. I could throw in a camera rig in here. I also have things like shader balls. I've got sets. I've got everything, every sort of model that I would ever want would be in here. And I save it in here and I keep it in here so that anytime I'm demoing or I'm doing something, I can just pull something in really easily, really quickly. The next one, you're familiar with the content browser, and that's what this is based on. And if you look next to this one, you've got my Arnold library, my Arnold material library. If you haven't started creating your own material library, no matter what renderer you use, I highly recommend you do so using this method because it makes it so much easier. If I want to create a material, I don't have to do it from scratch. I've already made a black plastic about a bajillion times. I'm just going to double click that, add that to my scene. I don't have to build it again, right? So keep everything at arm's length. I also have this folder called the junk folder. If you're like me, you have a junk folder at home and it's got like a bunch of crap in it, and you just keep throwing crap in it for months and months until one day like you can't shut it, and then you have to you're forced to organize it. Do this. I want you to, when you're working, have a junk folder right next to where you're working in the content browser. When you make an asset or a model or a rig or a camera, anything that you think you're going to use later on, drag it into your junk drawer. In fact, let's just do that really quickly here. Let's say for whatever reason, I'm going to want this Nikon camera again in some future project maybe. I'm going to go to the object lister. I'm going to find it first of all. I'm going to just hold it down, drag it, hold over my junk, let go. And because this is write protected, it's not letting me right now, but it will draw a thumbnail and put the file in there for you to use anytime you want. So it's a really great way to save time, and just like once in a while when this thing gets really full, take 10 minutes and organize it, put stuff back into your model directory. It's a really good idea to kind of keep your stuff organized like that. All right, so let's get to the real meat of what we're talking about here. Process, we talked about process, folder structure, naming, all that sort of thing. Now we're going to talk about the power of previs. Previs stands for pre-visualization. It's usually how I like to work. I like to create a really stripped down version of my animations and work out the timing in Premiere before I commit to anything, okay? And the way that I'm going to show you how to do that is really unique because I use takes and tokens. If you haven't used takes and tokens, you should, because they're insanely powerful, okay? So if we dive back into our scene here, you can see here, let's go back into the takes. You can see I've got a lot of takes here. And if you haven't explored takes, let me just take a minute to explain what they are. So takes is a way to kind of save multiple states of a project in one scene file. And they're super important, okay? So if you've been thinking about looking at them, or maybe you haven't even heard of them, look at them. Because there's three main uses that I see for takes, right? You can use them for multi-camera shoots, which is kind of what I'm going to show you next. You can use them to version something. Like let's say that you make a client version of, a client wants something blue, you want it to be red. You can create an alt version where it's red and blue, and it's all in one scene file. You can also use it as a layering system, foreground, background, that sort of thing. So, but I'm going to show you a quick way. You can see here, I'm just going to hit play on this scene file. So this is the actual previs from the promo that I showed you. And I'm just going to start to click through the different shots. Shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, shot 4, shot 5, shot 6, and shot 7. So this is how I organized my entire edit. And you can see here the way takes work. Let me just zoom out for a second and show you what it's doing. So if I go to shot 1, you can notice the floorboards are actually, there's not very many of them, and actually the background plate's gone, there's no mug. That's because takes is letting me hide stuff I don't need to see in that shot. And I'm using the camera called shot 1, or cam 1. So you can change the cameras, you can change anything in Cinema 4D with takes. It's so powerful. All right, let's go to shot 2. You can see I needed more floorboards in this shot. Shot 3, I needed the coffee mug comes in. Shot 4, the coffee mug, the markers, everything comes in. Shot 5, we've got the dynamic sims coming in. Shot 6, we've got everything. And shot 7, we have everything as well. We even have more floorboards, okay? So takes allows me to save multiple states of my project in one scene file. Think about how much space that's going to save you and how much time that's going to save you. Okay, so let's just say like, okay, that's great, Chad, but like, let's say in shot 1, the client says, we like this shot, Chad, but we want this Nikon camera that you're showing here at the end. Let me just make this go a little bit further here. And let me move everything over a little bit. So we like this, but this Nikon camera is way too close to this other Nikon camera. We need to change that. And I said, okay, that's fine, no problem. I'm just going to go ahead and create an alt take of shot 1. So I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm just going to duplicate this take, and then I'm just going to double click it, and I'm going to name it shot 1 _ alt, okay? Now, I'm going to make that take active, and now I've already got the Nikon selected. I'm going to go into my attributes of this Nikon. I'm going to go to the coordinates. I'm going to grab its position. I'm going to right-click and say Override. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm telling Cinema to say, hey, listen, look at these parameters. I'm going to override this in this take. So remember this. And so all I have to do now is move my camera back away from the other camera, and I'm done. I can go back to shot 1. I got it just the way I liked it. And I got shot 2 as an alt for the client, and then I can go back to shot 2, and it pops right back where it was. I mean, it's fantastic. It's so useful. Now, if you notice, you can actually see next to it here, in the override tree, you can actually see what it's doing in the take. You can see what layers are involved. You can see what attributes are actually being changed in that take. It knows I changed these coordinates in that take, right? So imagine that workflow with shaders, with lights, with animation. It works with animation. I could have a completely different camera animation if I wanted to as a separate take. It's super powerful once you start to understand how this works. So after that, you know, these previs shots needed to be rendered, right? And that's the next thing I want to talk about is tokens. Is anybody here using tokens? Yeah, one person? Okay, by the end of this, next year when I come here, at least 2 people should have their hands up. I mean, this is like so powerful. When I show you this is probably my favorite part of this demo. Okay, so tokens. What the heck is a token? And in order to explain it properly, I had to make sure that I wrote it down because it is a little bit tricky to explain. But once you understand it, it's phenomenal. So tokens are simple text variables that are used in file names and paths. Now that sounds like super technical and crazy, but don't be scared. It's really not that difficult. In fact, if you go to your render settings and you go to save, you can notice that there's in R18, there's this nice little triangle right here. And if you just click down, you can see what the tokens are. These are tokens, okay? Now I have CV tokens, which is Cineversity has a plugin that expands the use of tokens that I highly recommend you pick up because it really kind of takes tokens and like notches them up a bit. So if you do use tokens, you can do what I've done here and create an entire output that doesn't require any manual naming. I don't have to name my outputs again. And the reason that I don't have to do that is because, it's going back 2 directories, it's going into my renders folder, it's going into my C4D previs, it's going to name a folder after the name of my take using this token, it's going to name a folder after the month, date, and year after this token, and then it's going to grab the time. And then in my name for my editor, because my editor is kind of he's a little crazy. He wants to make sure that he's using the latest shots, and he wants to make sure that he's using the latest project file. So I have a token here that grabs the project name, the take, the resolution, and the FPS. Okay? So these little text variables are going to call information from my Cinema 4D scene and put it into my output. Okay? I'm not doing anything crazy here. I'm just going to change my output to 60 frames because we don't want to render a lot. And we're going to render out shot 1. You can notice here there's little yellow circles here. Now these are so I can activate takes for rendering. So I can activate multiple takes. It's almost like a render queue. I can activate this take. This is the one I'm going to render. And then I can say render mark takes. So I'm only rendering 1 take. So let's go ahead and render this to the picture viewer. It's going to bark at me about that. And I'm going to talk about this cool little stuff that's happening at the bottom of the frame next. In fact, I'll make it even cooler than it looks right now. When I discovered this watermark at the bottom, which I'll go over, I was so blown away by that. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this output. So you can see I've got the output right here. I'm going to double click it. Automatically, I didn't name anything. Oops. No, I do not want to download that. Okay, so I didn't name anything. I didn't name an output. Wow, this is not set to loop. It's very annoying. Let me just change that really quickly. Get out of my way. All right, so if you notice, my editor is going to be able to open up this clip. They're going to be able to know the date it was created, the lens that was used, the project file that created it, the camera used, and the take. So this is very, very powerful when you start working with an editor and you start cranking out shots and you're not really sure what they're going to use in the edit and you're just fooling around and making cool stuff. Now, I haven't done anything, right? I just rendered that out and we just played it. So now if I were to render this again, you'd say, well, he's going to override that render. What's he doing? He should change the file name or he should change something, right? Not going to worry about it. In fact, I'm just going to render it again. It didn't bark at me that I was going to render over something. So we're going to let this finish, and you're going to see what my editor would see if he opened up this file structure. So my editor is going to look at this. Now keep in mind, this is what's really rad, because you can see here I opened it up, and look at this. My editor goes into the previs folder. He goes into shot 1. He sees today's date. He sees 2 times. So this was the first one I did that I showed you. And then I rendered again, and it created another one at 1400 hours, 54 minutes, and 5 seconds. So if you set up your tokens this way, you'll never overwrite a render again. You'll never have to name an output again. Once you start working this way, it's just like it's a no-brainer. Hit render, cool, done. Don't have to worry about it. It's saved. I didn't overwrite it, no problems. All right, but now let's get to the fun bit here, because I really like this watermark in my previs, not only because it gives me really great information, but because it looks really cool. And that can just be found by creating, what I've done here is just created a really low quality standard render for my Playblast. And I created a render preset called Playblast with HUD, which is basically using the watermark. If you haven't checked out watermark, it's great because it actually uses tokens as well. You can come in here and pick out what you want the watermark to show. If this is for clients, it'll make you look like you know what you're doing, in my case. You can also do this cool thing where you can add your logo. So let me go ahead and find our logo. Let's see. I hope it's in here. If it's not, you already know our logo anyway, so it's not like let's see. Maybe I don't have it. Huh. Well, the other thing too, if you notice here, there's a file input right here so that when you do have your logo, which I seem to have misplaced, you can imagine the Grayscale Gorilla logo right here. But it's just a nice way, not only for you to communicate with your editor what you're doing in your shot, what's happening in your project, but it's also great when you're sending it to a client because they look at that, it looks professional, looks like you know what you're doing, it's great. So that kind of covers a little bit about my previs workflow. Now I want to talk to you about what I call layout, which is, layout to me is like I've gotten these shots approved and now I want to move into lighting. I want to move into texturing. So I'm moving my shots out of previs and into layout. So let's go ahead and open up one of my layout scenes. Okay, so here we have shot 1 in our layout scene. And I'm just going to go ahead and play this down so that you can see it. And you can see we're missing something, right? We're missing our Nikon cameras. And the reason that we're missing the Nikon cameras is because they are going to be XREFs. For those of you that aren't familiar with XREFs, it sort of stands for external reference. So imagine that you had like this water bottle, and this water bottle was going to show up in 30 shots of your production. And at any moment, the client might come in and say, you know what, you're using the wrong label. You're going to have to redo it. So if you weren't using XREFs, you had to go into each 20 of those shots and update the material, right? So the way XREFs work is they save this water bottle over here, and then it's just referenced in all the other shots. So if I were to change it here, it gets changed everywhere it's being referenced, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add this XREF. So I'm going to hit Shift-C. And if another fantastic hotkey, Shift-C is a great way to bring up the search tool to enter just about anything in Cinema. So I'm just going to say XREF. I'm going to say Add XREF. And I'm going to go to my Nikons. I'm going to find them. They're right there. Cool. And they pop right in the scene, right? Perfect. This is really useful because I might want to change the textures of these Nikons, and I don't want to have to dive into a bunch of different shots. So that's why I use XREFs on certain elements that I know I'm going to tweak multiple times over and over. I'm not going to spend too much time on XREFs because I really want to spend more time talking about the Object Manager. The Object Manager is probably where you spend a lot of your time, but there's little hacks that you can do to make it work for you even better. I mean, everybody knows about the search function, right? Everybody knows about the little magnifying glass. You could start to come in here and type in something like camera. You can come in here and start to type something like, whatever's in your scene. And it's a great way to search for things, right? Well, what I found to be really useful is not to just have one object manager, but to have 2 or 3 or 4, depending on what I'm doing. I'm going to create another object manager, and I'm just going to go ahead and dock it right underneath this one. And in this one, I'm just going to search for cam. Okay, so this is my camera right here. If I wanted to, I could just leave this up. So now I have an object manager specifically for my cameras. And just to be, because I'm nerdy like that, I'm going to go ahead and name it. I'm going to name that object manager cam. So I know that's where I'm going to put my cameras. That's what I want to see in that object manager. It's a good idea to think about having multiple object managers if you have complex scenes. Okay. The other thing that I really love are bookmarks. How many people here have used or touched the bookmarks button in the Object Manager? Nobody? 2 people. Okay, good. Awesome, you're ahead of the game. Bookmarks, when I found them, I was like, this is amazing. Why haven't I played with this before? What it does is it allows you to save filters. And you're saying, like, what the hell's a filter? What is he talking about? So if I hit this little eyeball button right here, I can actually come into here and start to say, what do I want to show or what do I want to hide in my scene, in my Object Manager, rather. So in my case, I made this object manager called cam, so it makes more sense to just kind of hide everything that's not a camera, right? So I hit everything that's not a camera. I'm going to go ahead and close it, and I'm going to say, let's make sure I didn't do something wrong here. Oh, I'm also going to have to turn on null because I believe my camera is on a null. Let's make sure I did that right. Yes, cool. So now if I come over to bookmarks and I say add bookmark, right? It shows up as a bookmark. It shows up bookmark 0, but I don't like that, so I'm going to go ahead and double click that and change that to cam. So now I've created a bookmark for cameras that I can easily access. So I'm going to go ahead and unfilter everything, go back to my default bookmark, which is basically like showing everything in your scene. So now, at any point in time, I can come over to bookmarks and say, I just want to see my cams real quick. And I can hide the filter. And now it's just showing me my cameras. Anything having to do with my cameras, my focal point, my camera null, my camera object. And you can start to do this for everything. In my case, I did it for cloners, so I've already pre-made these bookmarks for just anything that's cloners. I made one for lights. We don't have any lights in the scene, but if you did, they would be right there. Selection objects, I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But it's a great way to like save these little moments where you can say, okay, you know what, this is like getting out of control. I just want to see my cloners, and I just want to deal with my cloners. It's a great way to do that. The other thing that I also like to do is I like to leave myself breadcrumbs. And I call those breadcrumbs, but they're really just annotations. Anybody here using annotations? No? Okay, cool. So you're gonna walk away from this and use annotations after this, I hope, because they're pretty rad. Okay, so let's say you're going to save this file out, and in this particular shot, actually, the markers are bigger in this shot than they are in the other shots. So I want to make sure I leave myself a note, or maybe leave the other artist a note to make sure they understand, hey, just so you know, I had to scale up the markers in this shot, so be aware of it. So you can see right here in my large marker node, that's a really hard thing to say, I've got an annotation tag, which is just available right up here in your tags, just annotation, boom, right there. And I've already made one that says, these Copic markers are slightly larger in this shot, so I don't forget, right? So I just type it in there, and it's there as a tag if I want to see it, but I could also turn on Show in Viewport. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me this cool little thought bubble or speech bubble to remind me when I open this shot 2 years from now and I wonder why the Copic markers are bigger and I think I may have made a mistake across the entire shot, and I remind myself, oh, that's right, I did that on purpose. Okay, cool. And if you're handing stuff off to other artists, leave them notes. Leave them annotation notes and just like, hey man, this camera is, you know, not the right camera. Make sure this is just for previs and not for real, or whatever your note is, leave yourself a breadcrumb for that. It's really important. And they're kind of fun to look at. You can even, you know, leave yourself a joke, maybe. So next thing I want to talk about are layers. Oh, actually, you know what? I did forget one of my favorite things. I'm going to ask one more question. How many people here are aware of selection objects? Yes, yes, cool. So selection objects are, I came from 3ds Max and we had this thing called selection sets, which would essentially allow you to select a bunch of objects and put them into a selection set so that you would never have to go and hunt them down and select them again. And when I came to cinema, I was really looking for that and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I ended up like stumbling upon these selection objects, and they work very, very similarly. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. I'm going to come back to this scene in a minute, but you can see right here, you've got these really weird looking objects that has a box with a little pointer next to it. And these are selection objects. These are objects that are created to hold on to selections in your scene. So if I go over to object, you can see this main object, this main camera object selection object is holding my main camera. So if I double click that, it's going to select my main camera. If I double click window middle, it's going to select whatever is in my window middle selection object. They're very easy to create. And if you're like me and you have scenes that maybe you got from someone else, or maybe you got them from from online like TurboSquid or something, it's a really great way to not have to search down these ridiculously long object manager lists. So let's just make one really quickly for something that's way down here that we don't ever want to try to find again. Let's say it's going to be, I don't know, this guy right here. I don't know what this is, but we're going to create a selection object for it so that we don't ever have to hunt down line 271 ever again. Hold down Shift-C, Command. I'm going to start typing selection. Selection. And you can see it's the second one down here. I'm going to double-click that just to make sure it's right. Okay, so it added it to my selection object. Now I can just type this thing I don't want to select again, or find again, I guess would be better. All right, so now anytime that I don't want to hunt through that list, it's right here, double click, that weird object that is buried in my object manager is selected. I don't have to worry about it. Okay, enough of that part. Let's jump back into that other scene, and I'm going to start to show you how I work with layers. If you haven't started exploring layers in Cinema 4D, you need to, because they're super powerful. They're very, very handy. In fact, I try to organize my scenes with layers as much as possible. I'll open up this scene that's actually pre-layered up. At least I hope it is. Let's see. Okay, yes, it is pretty much. So you can see here I've got layers for my XREF, layers for my cams, my lights, my floor, and you can also have layers within layers, nested layers, whatnot. It's a great way to organize your scene, but it's also a great way to speed up your FPS if you're hitting play. I'm going to show you some ways to speed that up as well. Quickly, though, I'm going to show you what this means. All layers are as a way to organize your Cinema 4D scene, the assets in your scene. So here you've got the name of your layer, and the little S stands for solo. The little V stands for visible in scene. R means renderability. M means, is it going to show up in my object manager? L means you can lock stuff down. You can see I've got my cameras locked because it's already lock shot. I can turn animation on and off, generators on and off, deformers on and off, Espresso on and off, and I don't know why it's not showing XREFs, maybe because I don't have any, or maybe it's because I don't know why. It should be an XREF one here too, but anyway. So let's go ahead and I'm going to show you all the different ways that you can create layers and assign them. But before I do that, I have kind of a an idea about layers. One thing that I like to do when I'm starting a project, if I'm working with other people, is I like to say, okay, well, let's not only take a look at our naming conventions and our folder structure, but let's also take a look at our layer colors, because you can see here, you're probably wondering, like, all these scenes Chad keeps showing have these really weird colors in them. Like, what's the deal with that? That's because in 3ds Max, I kind of got used to working this way. And the way I like to work is I create colors for my layers that are based on my scenes. So like maybe geometry is blue, cameras are always red, lights are always yellow. So that when I open a scene, I know exactly what I'm looking at and where to go. And if you start to establish these types of workflows with your team and you decide early on, okay guys, hey man, cloners we're going to make purple, and you do a little color key. That way, when you open a scene file, you immediately know what's going on. Okay? That's a good idea to try to do that. Let's just create a layer really quickly. I'm just going to double click in the layer view here. And I'm going to double click the name, and we're going to make a layer for our XREFs. Or actually, our XREFs already have a layer. We just need to put them in there. So actually, let me hit escape, and we'll delete that layer and just put these guys in the right place. Let's grab these layers and dump them into our XREF layer, so we can nest them down, right? So now if I wanted to, I can actually hide the top level of that layer, or if I hold down Control, I can actually toggle the entire layer and any sub-layers. So I'm hiding all of my XREF objects right now. So that's kind of a true thing in Cinema altogether. If you hold down Control, you can sometimes toggle a hierarchy on and off. It's very useful. So let's jump back into our unorganized scene, which is going to be here. And I'm going to show you a couple ways that you can assign objects to layers. Double-click this layer, and let's go ahead and make one for our cloners. So let's grab our floorboards and our dust, and I'm going to hold down Control when I drag it into the layer so the children become a part of that layer as well. If I didn't do that, let's say that I just grabbed the top level and I just dragged it in like this. If I open this up, you're going to see that everything underneath it, if I move this over a little bit, you can see it, nothing is part of that layer, only the top level, right? There's a couple different ways I could add these children. I could click down here and I could paint them into that layer just by holding down the mouse. Or I could undo that and grab the top level, hold down Control, drag it into a layer, and they all are part of that layer. Another way to assign something to a layer is to drag the layer onto the object itself. You could actually come over here and just drag it onto the object if you wanted to do that. There's also a lot of other ways you could do it. In fact, you could do it through the attributes right here. You could tell it, okay, well, what layer you want to be on. Let's see, layer. You can come over here, add a new layer, all that sort of thing. Creating layers is also just as simple. In fact, you could, grab a bunch of objects and then right-click in here and say Create Layer, New Layer from Object Selection, and it'll automatically give them a color, and then you can just double-click and name it. So the layer view, there's a lot of ways that you can organize your scene to make it go faster, right? I said that earlier. So let's take a look at what that means. You can see here I've got a pretty complicated scene, and let me go ahead and make sure everything is on. Yep, cool. Let's also make sure we're doing all frames, and this is 30, cool. So if you have like a complicated scene that maybe isn't giving you the fastest frames per second that you want, it's a great idea to organize your scene into layers, because you can start to toggle things on and off that's going to speed up your FPS. So right now, it's going pretty quickly, but if we had dynamics and maybe 100 more chairs in here, it would start to slow down. So one thing I like to do is try to keep my cams and my lights in a separate layer, as I said before, because if I actually turn down, let's actually show the HUD so that we can see what it is. I want to see my frames per second. Okay, there we go. So we're getting pretty decent frames per second, which is showing up down here at the bottom, but we could do better than that. So let's get in here and make that even faster. So let's go ahead and turn off our lights in the scene, because we're just doing previs right now. We don't need to see shadows. We don't need to see any of the lights. You can see I've just jumped up my frames per second by a ton. So again, lights were giving me 80 to 100. Turn them off, I'm getting 300 frames per second. So it's a great way to speed things up. The other thing that you can do as well, if you don't want to turn the lights off, you don't have to, you can leave them on. You can come over to the chair effectors, the room geo, and turn off the generators. So now I'm just looking at the single chair that was cloned, and I'm able to kind of time out my camera and kind of gauge my shot. If that's not giving me the frames per second that I need, then maybe getting rid of these trees in the background might help. So those are on a separate layer, really easy to get rid of. Just turn off the visibility, boom, they're gone. That bought me a little bit FPS. But where you're going to see the most FPS change is probably going to be either in dynamics or with lights and shadows. So layering things up is going to mean that you're going to be able to organize your scene and be able to turn things on and off to get you faster frames per second, less of that horrible lag that nobody wants to deal with. Also, layers, I don't know if you know this, but they also work in the material editor as well. In fact, I love using them for materials. Let's go ahead and dive back into my organized scene. You can see here, let me undock this, throw this around. It's another thing I love about Cinema, the fact that you can just undock stuff and throw it around. So you can see here I've got layers in my material view as well. Now this is a great way to kind of organize your scene, not only both on an object level and a layer level, but on a material level. Because sometimes you can have a scene that has hundreds and hundreds of materials and you're just going to go crazy. So there's a couple of different ways that you can assign materials to layers, but really there's one that I just kind of like best, which is to just drag the material directly into the layer that you want it associated with. In this case, I'm going to do floorboards on this wood texture, and I've instantly got a floorboard layer, and there it is. So now I can start to organize my scene, my materials, the same way that I'm organizing my geometry. It makes for a very easy workflow when you're opening a scene up and somebody has taken the time to put the materials into layers, and you can understand exactly what it means because they're actually pointing back to the actually scene layers, and you can understand what's going on a lot better that way. So let's just wrap this up. What did we talk about? Process hacks. Process is important, okay? Project folder structure matters. Create a project folder that works for you. I'm going to share mine so you'll be able to download it. Scene starters, as opposed to just cold opening Cinema, create projects that are ready to go for whatever workflow. You're doing Instagram, whatever. Create a workflow for Instagram so that all you do is double click that scene file, open Cinema, start working. Change layouts to match your mission. Create and change Cinema 4D to do whatever you want to do. You're doing a lot of modeling, make an awesome modeling layout. The content browser is good. In fact, it's not, I should have changed that. It's awesome. It's so great to have things right at arm's length. Keep that every day. It's like your backpack. It's like anything you carry with you every day, your models, camera rigs, whatever. Keep it there, right to the side. Previs. I showed you how to use takes and tokens to eliminate mistakes, create faster, make life easier for your editor, hopefully. I showed you my layout and how I use object manager tips or object manager hacks to kind of make things work better. Selection objects, multiple object managers, bookmarks, leaving yourself breadcrumbs, covered layers. So hopefully out of all that stuff, I really just if you could just like take one of these things home and do it, I would be happy. And let me know if you have any of your own kind of process hacks or any sort of workflow tips. I'm going to be over at the Grayscale Gorilla booth, and I want to hear them because I'm always looking for new things and new ways to kind of like hack my workflow and make it better and faster. So come by and say hi, please, and let me know what you think of this. And if you have any ideas to make it better, I'm totally willing to listen to that. With that, thank you very much. My name was Chad Ashley. I'm from Grayscale Gorilla, and thank you.